She's a dedicated scholar in nutrition and nutritional research. She is currently a postdoctoral teaching fellow in both nutrition and research, where she assists students with unpacking the intricacies of nutrition, assisting students with research design and methodology, and serves on dissertation committees. She has a passion for helping others. She actively contributes to academic dialogue, including presentations at conferences and serving as a journal reviewer. Traci, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dean Moss, and thank you all for being here. As I told Dean Moss in April earlier, I feel like I'm defending again, but this time it's all said and done, so we can move forward. So again, thank you all for being here, and we will just jump right in. So my dissertation research was the comparison of nutrition knowledge and dietary habits between legally blind and sighted adults. And as we get into it, I want to send a shout out to my dream team, my committee as well. My chair methodologist was Dr. Gina Gonzalez, and my readers were Dr. Jessica Weissman and Dr. Sherry Youngblood. And they, too, like Michelle, they were phenomenal. They were pivotal in my success. And I couldn't be more grateful for the team that I had. So as we get into this, I wanted to kind of give a little backstory or a little history of why this was important to me. I am legally deaf and blind myself, so I know personally a firsthand account of the difficulties and the barriers to nutrition knowledge, the access, how we learn, and things like that, even down to reading the microscopic nutrition fact labels that we all see. So our objectives for today are going to be, I'm going to cover the background and overview, the purpose and the problem, a brief literature review, the methodology, results and the findings, and brace yourself. The results and the findings are substantial, and the implications and future directions, and then we'll open it up for questions. And I wanted to say too, if there's a time where you can't hear me, or if I'm talking too fast, please feel free to interrupt and say, hey, slow down. So the background. Disability in the United States presents a multifaceted challenge, as evidenced by the substantial health disparities that will be unveiled in this study on legally blind adults specifically. And I'll get into the definition here in a moment. So according to the U.S. Census Bureau and the CDC, 61 million Americans, and now 70 million as of the data published this year, have some form of disability or different ability. I'm going to change that word disability one day. So of the 61 million, 7.5 million contend with a visual impairment. And the updated statistics on this information with the new 70 million data has not been updated yet. So for the purpose of this study, the terms legally blind and visually impaired are going to be used synonymously. 7.5 million people contend with visual impairment, as we discussed. And for the purposes, so to define what I mean by visual impairment or legal blindness, visual impairment is a very loosely defined term, and includes total, partial, and legally blind. As you see here, legal blindness is defined by the Social Security Administration of those that have a visual acuity, which is central vision, of less than 20/200, or a visual field, which is typically 180 degrees if those that have legal blindness is less than 20 degrees. So for myself, just to give a context, whereas normal sighted adults or individuals have 180 degrees peripheral field, I have less than 5 degrees. So the statement of the problem. So despite the high prevalence of chronic diseases in the United States and the potential impact of nutrition knowledge on reducing these chronic diseases,
and the risk, visually impaired individuals, particularly those who are legally blind, face unique challenges in making informed and health promoting dietary choices. Aligning with previous researchers' findings, 88.2% of legally blind adults compared to 46% of the general population have poor dietary habits and a higher prevalence of chronic disease. This led me to seek a possible factor that could be contributing to the high prevalence of disparities, and which means potentially a lack of nutrition knowledge. So the purpose of the study. So really kind of what's the point? Why study, right? So in recent years, we've seen a tremendous growth in scientific knowledge of the relationship between diet and health. This increase in knowledge has informed dietary recommendations to promote health and longevity, and has sparked national campaigns to educate Americans on more healthful eating habits. But then I'll question, but how has this affected the average person? When we think about what we learned in, you know, elementary school and the food pyramid is quite different than what we are learning today. So that was one question. Another question was, does the typical American know much about nutrition? Is the average level of nutrition knowledge on the rise? And what implications does this have for legally blind adults? So this led me to the purpose of the study was to assess if and to what extent differences exist in nutrition knowledge and dietary habits between legally blind and normal-sighted adults in the United States. I assessed the differences in both nutrition knowledge and dietary habits based on visual acuity or visual status, which may be a contributing factor to health disparities and the great rates of chronic disease we see today. Alongside the nutrition knowledge piece, I also wanted to assess a snapshot, so to speak, of dietary intake because I wanted to see overall, does visual acuity also have an impact or is a factor to nutritional choice? So overall, the purpose was to assess the differences. So this leads me to the theoretical framework. The framework employed in this dissertation research was the social cognitive theory, and it serves as a critical lens through which the problem, purpose, and research questions were framed. So it was developed by Albert Bandura in the late 80s, and SCT contextualizes the challenges of nutrition knowledge and dietary habits among legally blind and sighted adults, emphasizing the role of self-efficacy and behavioral capability. Those are the two constructs built within SCT that I really honed in on. So the purpose of using SCT was to better understand the possible differences and potential interplay between nutrition knowledge, self-efficacy, behavioral capability, and dietary choices. So SCT informed the research questions by highlighting key constructs, ensuring that they are rooted in a solid theoretical foundation. So in other words, SCT may inform us about how knowledge, specifically nutrition knowledge, plays a pivotal role in self-efficacy and behavioral capability of knowing and selecting nutrient-dense foods. So now to the literature review. It's widely known that almost half of the US population is obese, a BMI of 30 or higher. The highest rates of obesity are found between the ages of 20 to 59. Interestingly, 41.6% of legally blind adults are obese. So this indicates that obesity rates among visually impaired individuals is higher than the national average. And as you'll see here, as of 2023, I updated these slides today. As of 2023, the overall obesity percentage has decreased slightly, so that's a plus, to 40.3% compared to 41.9% in 2020. However, the prevalence of severe obesity, which is a BMI of 40 or higher, has increased, rising from 7.7% to 9.7%. So when we think about this in terms of population sizes, these statistics are quite staggering. Disability is associated with an increased risk of chronic diseases, creating a syndemic effect. And according to the CDC, individuals with disabilities have higher rates of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease compared to those without disabilities. Additionally, researchers have shown that visually impaired adults have higher BMI. And compared to sighted adults, those with visual impairment amplifies chronic disease risk. And as you can see here, adults with visual impairment are 2 to 3 times more likely to suffer from conditions like hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes. So a little bit more about the research that I had found. So some researchers have suggested that an adequate level of nutrition knowledge is related to more optimal nutrition behaviors and dietary intake. So additionally, within the literature review, I found that it also emphasized the role of nutrition knowledge in making healthier dietary choices. To add, researchers that examine nutrition knowledge in people with disabilities, such as visual impairment, found that up to 56% of those individuals select food based on habit rather than based on knowledge of nutritional content. And interestingly, there was a study done in 2022, 1,450 nationally representative participants between the ages of 18 to 64 across the US. And it was completed by MyFitnessPal, which is a food tracking app for achieving health and wellness goals. And they uncovered that while 81% of Americans, the participants claim to know the nutrition basics, 91% of the general population says they don't have any idea how much protein, fiber, carbohydrates, sugar, and salt they consume daily. I thought this was quite pivotal. Additionally, again, as I was updating this information, as of this year, 2024, a follow-up study was done by MyFitnessPal, and they revealed that 88% still lacks nutritional intake awareness. So the above information is part of a more prominent theme that reflects how nutrition plays a significant role in disease risk, manifestation, and prevalence, especially among those with visual impairment. So my study allowed me to investigate the differences between nutrition knowledge and dietary habits by revealing data to support that visual impairment or legal blindness may play a significant role in acquiring the necessary nutrition knowledge to prevent or reduce the risk of chronic diseases and poor health status. So of course, as in research, there's limitations. The limitations of the existing literature is that research on nutrition knowledge and dietary habits among legally blind adults specifically was very hard to find. And many of the studies that I did find, they included small and heterogeneous sample sizes, recruitment bias, methodological challenges related to data collection and accessibility. And many of them were overstudied adolescent or elderly groups, and overall an underrepresentation of legally blind individuals. And I want to add here too that many of the studies that use legally blind or visually impaired participants looked at the nutritional intake that led to that condition rather than how it hindered or promoted or the barriers to getting that knowledge. So the research questions and hypotheses. So my first research question was, to what extent do differences exist in nutrition knowledge between legally blind and normal-sighted adults ages 18 to 55 who reside in the US? The hypotheses were the null was that there were no significant differences in general nutrition knowledge between legally blind and sighted adults. And the alternative was that there was a significant difference. The second research question is, to what extent do differences exist in dietary habits between legally blind and normal-sighted adults? And again, the null was that there were no significant differences, and the alternative is that there were significant differences. So the methodology. So the rationale for using a quantitative causal comparative or ex post facto study design in investigating nutrition knowledge and dietary habits in adults is that it allows researchers like myself to identify the potential factors associated with higher levels of nutrition knowledge and health promoting dietary intake, and those that may be barriers to acquiring and utilizing basic nutrition knowledge. So by comparing nutrition knowledge and dietary habit scores between different groups, I was able to determine whether there's a significant difference between the groups and whether this difference is attributable to a specific factor such as visual acuity or status. Survey data in quantitative designs can effectively quantify data and provide responses that are tailored to the research problem and aligning with and answering the research questions. Plus, quant research is where my heart is. So the procedures and planning, this is kind of just a scaffolding of how the process went for me during my dissertation. IRB approval was granted on August 19th of 2023. And the next slide will show the flyer I created that was posted on social media, and I'll explain more about that process. I also created a general nutrition knowledge and dietary habits survey using SurveyMonkey, which combined two validated instruments, the General Nutrition Knowledge Questionnaire Revised and the Mini Eating Assessment Tool, and I'll cover those more shortly. The survey included inclusion and exclusion questions and the informed consent documentation. And October 4th, miraculously, the appropriate sample size was met and the survey was closed. Data was then downloaded and populated into SPSS version 26. And then I'll discuss the analysis procedures in the upcoming slides. So this was the recruitment flyer that I created that was posted across 3 different Facebook groups. And here is the participant criteria. So as you can see, the inclusion criteria was US adults between the ages of 18 to 55, male, female, and non-binary genders. Additionally, participants were asked to select an option that described their vision status. Again, according to the Social Security Administration, the guidelines of legal blindness of less than 20/200 and a visual field of less than 20 degrees. The exclusion criteria included participants that had degrees, certifications, or secondary nutrition education, adults working in public health or nutrition-related field, and adults without access to a computer or smartphone or assistive technologies should they require it. So the selection and sampling of my participants, I used a snowball sampling technique. And here's a visual of the non-probability snowball sampling technique that I used. The survey flyer and link were posted on 3 Facebook groups. These were specifically Blind and Vision Impaired Support Network, Blind and Visually Impaired People, and my personal Facebook group. And you can see here kind of how snowball sampling works. You know, you share it and you ask the participant to share with others, and then it just kind of compiles from there. Also, G-Power was used to determine the appropriate sample size. My sample size was 124. I was able to gain 131 participants. So now we get to talk about the instruments that were used. So first is the General Nutrition Knowledge Questionnaires, and I'm going to shorten it here because that's a mouthful. So the GNKQ was originally developed in the UK in 1999. It has since been revised by Kleeman et al. In 2016 and consists of 48 questions totaling 88 points. So the researchers have widely used the revised instrument across many geographic, demographic populations worldwide. And additionally, researchers have found the instrument to have good construct validity and a high test and retest and internal reliability with a Cronbach's alpha of 0.93. So some of the questions on the GNKQR, as you can see here, is probably really small. My apologies. Some of the questions consisted of what advice do experts give on how much of a food should we be consuming? Or if one is aware of specific food groups and the nutrients in certain foods, or the selection of healthy foods, and then what diseases may be diet related. So this was the second instrument that was used, and it was called the Mini-Eat, which is the eating assessment tool. And it's really useful for studying dietary habits of legally blind and sighted adults because it's very brief and efficient. It's just a snapshot in time, typically, and it was originally used in a clinical setting. So the tool was developed earlier in 2023 and was validated using a 5-fold cross-validation technique. The researchers demonstrated a strong correlation with the Healthy Eating Index score, and the Cronbach's alpha was 0.73. And the instrument also, of course, showed a high test and retest and internal reliability. The final version of the Mini-Eat consists of 9 questions, totaling 81 points. So the higher the score, the healthier eating pattern. So the overall study design and analysis was conducted using a quantitative causal-comparative design. I used 2 validated instruments that we just discussed. The independent variable was vision status, legally blind or normal sighted. The dependent variables were nutrition knowledge scores and dietary habit scores. So what I did is the mean scores were compared using an independent samples t-test with two-tailed means comparison. And for analysis and statistical power, the significance was determined using an alpha of 0.05, a priori, and a power level of 0.80. IBM SPS version 26 was used to analyze this data. So the results, this is the best part. So in my study, my primary focus was on examining the disparities in nutrition knowledge and dietary intake between sighted individuals and those with legal blindness or visually impaired. I assessed the extent of differences in nutrition knowledge and dietary habits between participants aged 18 to 55. So the descriptive analysis. So like I mentioned earlier, a total of 166 respondents responded to the survey, but due to incomplete responses or the initial criteria not being met, 35 respondents were disqualified and removed, leaving 131 participants in the final analysis. That was 66 legally blind participants and 65 normal sighted participants. And of course, the participants' ages ranged from 18 to 55. The mean age and standard deviations are shown here, in which both groups was about mid-30s. The total group consisted of 51.9% predominantly female, and 45.6% of those females reported having legal blindness. Furthermore, those who self-identified as male made up about 41.2% of the sample, and 53.7% of those males were legally blind. Non-binary adults made up a small portion of the sample at 6.9%, and the majority were legally blind. The highest level of education attainment among participants with normal sight was at the college level, while 54% of legally blind participants had the highest level of education being high school or GED. So it's important to note here that researchers and other studies found that approximately 75% of their visually impaired participants had only a high school diploma or GED as the highest level of education as well. So it's comparable information. Self-reported health status consisted of responses of poor, fair, good, very good, and excellent. And normal sighted participants reported mostly good health, while the legally blind participants reported mostly fair health status. Additionally, self-reported height and weight for each respondent was collected, and body mass index, or BMI, was calculated for all participants. The BMI across all participants excuse me, ranged from 17.2 to 49.8 kilograms per meter square, with a mean BMI of 27.7, which is in the overweight category. So BMI between normal-sighted and legally blind participants revealed a significant difference there. Normal-sighted participants averaged in the overweight BMI category, whereas legally blind participants had a higher mean BMI, but were still considered overweight. So the results. So as we move on to the nutrition knowledge scores, it's important to keep in mind that the higher the score, the more nutrition knowledge. So to answer the first research question, to answer the first research question, again, an independent samples t-test requires that assumptions be met. Those assumptions include independence of two groups, no outliers, no normality, and homogeneity of variance be met. And the two distinct groups consisted of 65 sighted adults and 66 legally blind adults, which met the assumptions of independence, and there were no extreme outliers. And I also double checked this by examining the z-scores and the interquartile range. However, the assumption of normality was violated, as evident by the Shapiro-Wilk test of normality. And research has shown that even though not all assumptions will be met, it is advisable, in studies with large sample sizes, i.e. my study, it's still advisable to move forward and employ the t-test and their associated confidence intervals when dealing with normality violated data. So now the results. There were significant differences in the nutrition knowledge scores when comparing the normal-sighted group to the legally blind group. The 95% confidence interval for the difference in means was calculated as 33.5 for the lower limit and 43 for the upper limit. The effect size for this analysis was 2.8 and was found to exceed Cohen's convention for a large effect at 0.08. So adults with normal sight scored significantly higher than legally blind adults by more than double. Continuing on with the second research question, again, assumptions were checked. Assumptions of independent normality and homogeneity of variance were also analyzed for the mini-EAT. The analysis met the assumptions of independence. No extreme outliers were found. Also, when examining the z-scores and the interquartile range, using Shapiro-Wilk's test, the assumption of normality was met for the legally blind group, but violated the assumption for the normal-sighted group. As mentioned earlier, it's been demonstrated by other research that even in the case when substantial sample sizes, it's not only feasible, but also recommended to move forward in the analysis. So even though the even though the violation may be due to the nature in which the original scored instrument was used in a clinical screening setting, I still move forward with the independent t-test to compare the dietary habit scores of the mini-EAT. And as you can tell, there were significant differences in dietary habits when comparing the two groups. As you can see, the difference in means was calculated as 2.14 for the lower limit and 7.7 for the upper limit, and the effect size for this analysis was 0.61, which was found to be just above Cohen's convention for a medium effect, which is 0.5. And adults with normal sight had significantly healthier dietary habits than legally blind adults. So analysis of the findings. So my study unveiled substantial disparities in nutrition knowledge and dietary habits between legally blind and sighted adults. Legally blind participants exhibited significantly lower general nutrition knowledge scores with nearly twofold difference between them and their sighted counterparts. So existing research using the GNKQ, the instrument, has already established that nutrition knowledge scores tend to be relatively low in the overall general population, which was around 70, supporting the findings in my study. My study also addressed the possible role of education attainment in nutrition knowledge, finding that legally blind participants had lower educational attainment compared to sighted counterparts. The lower educational levels observed among legally blind adults align with prior research indicating that visually impaired individuals often face barriers to education, leading to a limited access to learning opportunities. My study really reaffirmed this connection, demonstrating that legally blind adults had higher BMIs, body mass index, indicating an elevated risk of obesity, a well-known risk factor for a chronic condition. And this concurs with previous research that suggests individuals with visual impairment or legal blindness face unique challenges in maintaining a healthy weight and emphasizing the need for targeted interventions addressing obesity and chronic disease within the legally blind community. So what are the strengths and limitations of my study? So my study addressed the crucial issue of differences in nutrition knowledge and dietary habits among legally blind adults. So I had a substantial sample size of 131. I used the use of standardized instruments, the GNKQR and the Mini-EAT. And my study obviously provided significant findings. So furthermore, the inclusion of two distinct groups, legally blind and normally sighted, it strengthens the internal validity and demonstrates a large effect size, highlighting the substantial differences in nutrition knowledge and dietary habits between the groups. Those are the strengths. But we always have to discuss the limitations. So despite the strengths of my study, it relied on self-reported data. So it could introduce recall and reporting biases. And my study primarily focuses on nutrition knowledge and dietary habits and did not delve into specific dietary patterns or food consumption in detail, nor did it dive into the perceptions and the experiences of learning and or selecting foods from a legally blind person's perspective. So the causal comparative design limits the establishment of causal relationships, and the study does not explore specific mechanisms contributing to these differences. So to address these limitations, future research should investigate the factors that influence nutrition knowledge and food choices in legally blind individuals. So the significance. So again, what was the point? The significance. Simply put, knowledge is power. The completed research exposed knowledge gaps and nutritional disparities. While this study explicated poor knowledge among both groups, the significance here is that legally blind participants fared worse, thus highlighting the need for more inclusive and equitable nutrition education and interventions. So examining nutrition knowledge and dietary habits helped identify areas where adults may require additional support. Nutrition knowledge may enhance food nourishment, as you can see by the graphic here, which leads to whole health flourishment. So some of the future recommendations, research, and interventions, and I'm being mindful of time here. So I'm just going to kind of go through these briefly. So targeted interventions really need to enhance nutrition knowledge and promote healthier dietary practice. And a part of this kind of opened my eyes to think we probably need this to occur in our elementary schools rather than in adult schools. However, it's never too late to learn, right? So I think we could all benefit from young age to old age. These targeted interventions would be substantial. So there are I feel there also needs to be programs focusing on obesity prevention and management, and it should be tailored to specific needs of not only legally blind, but also normal-sighted adults. We are all unique and we all need those tailored interventions. Future research should explore relationships between nutrition knowledge, dietary habits, and chronic diseases among visually impaired adults, specifically those that are legally blind, providing a deeper understanding of the dynamics and mechanisms. Potentially longitudinal studies can help track changes in nutrition knowledge and dietary practices among legally blind and sighted adults over time. Additionally, improving access to nutrition education and resources for the visually impaired and legally blind is essential, really, to address the disparities in nutritional knowledge and dietary habits, fostering really a healthier, more empowered life for legally blind individuals as well as sighted counterparts. So, based on the findings of my study, there is a clear need for targeted interventions, as I spoke to, and these interventions should be sensitive to the specific challenges faced by this group and other groups, with more inclusive enhancement of self-efficacy and behavioral capabilities, which connects us back to social cognitive theory, the theoretical framework. So, all in all, this really aligns with previous research that has highlighted associations between visual impairment and an increased risk of chronic diseases, making it essential to develop strategies that address the health disparities and nutritional gaps. So in conclusion, the findings of my study underscore the critical importance of addressing the health disparities experienced by the legally blind adult population. So by improving nutrition knowledge and dietary habits through tailored intervention, we can mitigate the elevated risks of chronic diseases and poor health status among this group and other groups, ultimately enhancing overall well-being. So my study really sheds light on the substantial differences between legally blind adults and sighted adults, emphasizing the crucial role of education in shaping these differences. So it calls to attention the need for targeted interventions to enhance accessible, inclusive, and innovative ways of increasing nutrition knowledge and promoting healthier dietary practices. Excuse me. So the differences and disparities in nutrition knowledge and dietary habits should not persist. And really, collectively, we can work towards a future where blindness is no longer synonymous with nutritional disadvantage. It's time to redefine how we approach nutritional education for the visually impaired or legally blind, and foster a world where everyone, regardless of their level of vision, can savor the taste of a healthier, more informed life.
Thank you so much, Dr. Meadows.